This is Dina Marie, and in the year 2025, Pope Francis gave us a year of hope, a beautiful opportunity for us to really focus on the hope that we have in Jesus Christ. And now in 2026, our Holy Father, Pope Leo, has invited us to look at an individual, but look more not at that individual, but the life that he lived. And that's the life of Saint Francis of Assisi, who died 800 years ago in 1226. With me today to focus on that legacy, that life of St. Francis, which is tied directly to the love of Jesus Christ, is my friend, Franciscan Friar Father Dan Pattee. Welcome, Father Dan, and thanks for joining us during this Jubilee year dedicated to St. Francis.
Well, thank you. Thank you, Dina Marie. It's good to be with you again, and Happy New Year and Happy Jubilee Year of St. Francis. We're so blessed to have this.
I think it's exciting to go from one jubilee to the next. I don't remember that happening, but it kind of to keep that enthusiasm, not only to observe a jubilee, but to participate in it. We should be changed by these opportunities of the church for grace. Tell us a little bit, Father Dan, because this Jubilee, particularly, I mean, it's directed to the whole church, universal, but in a special way to all Franciscan communities. And there are a lot of them over the last 800 years that have been formed. So, what does this say to you as a Franciscan friar?
Well, when you have the Holy Father declaring a Jubilee year of this Saint Francis, it says something about the universal appeal of Saint Francis, I think, and the way this saint speaks to our times. He is 800 years ago, he passed away, but he still is speaking to us, and especially in the wake of the papacy of the first pope to take the name of Francis. And so I think it says something. The Lord certainly didn't light this particular lamp of Francis to have us put it under a bushel basket. So now it's going to be put on the lampstand for all to see in the church.
I think it's interesting you say the one pope, the first pope who took St. Francis's name, it was after Pope Francis's passing that we have this special focus on the Jubilee. I just have a feeling that Pope Francis has something to do with this in a special way. But if
Mhm.
you could put into some words just some of the legacy that you think St. Francis has left behind in his life example.
Well, I'll tell you, I mean, if you want to look at, say, our culture today, how do I say this in 20 words or less? All right, so we have in our times a kind of a polarization. I think most people would recognize in our culture. Well, see, Francis had polarization in his culture too. His polarization, however, was between the nobility and an emerging merchant class. The nobility, the only way you could be wealthy and powerful at the time of Francis when he was born in 1182 was to be born into wealth, and that would be the nobility. But Francis's father belonged to a newly emergent class, the merchant class, that in our culture today, we're used to this. We call them businessmen, and they sell goods in exchange for money. Well, this new merchant class, as they became more and more prominent, they began to become more powerful, and the nobility felt threatened, and they wanted to put them down. Well, Francis's father was a merchant. Francis was being trained to be a merchant, and so you get a lot of fighting going on. In fact, Francis even at one point in 1202, the merchant class rose up in Assisi against the nobles, chased them out, tore down their castles, and took the bricks from their castles and fortified the walls for the fight against the nobility to justify their existence. And I don't think Francis sat in his bedroom while that was going on. I think he was out there fighting, with his father and everything. And then the nobility ran to Perugia, neighboring town, and then Perugia and Assisi went to battle, and Francis put on knight's clothing. He was actually in the fight. And it was at that time that Francis was hit off his horse. They would have killed him if he'd been a peasant, but because he had knight's clothing on, they figured he had money, so they took him to prison. And it was sure enough, his father put up a big sum of money and ransomed his son, hoping he'd come back, get back into the business, the merchant, the cloth selling, and all this stuff. But Francis was disillusioned. He was depressed. It wasn't what he thought it would be, the glory of a knight and the fight for a cause and all this. Long story short, he ends up going to San Damiano. The cross speaks to him and says, "Go, Francis, rebuild my church, which, as you see, is falling into ruins," which Francis took to mean St. Damien. So I'm going to start to build it with brick and mortar. He did what he knew how to do. He goes to his father's cloth store, takes a bunch of cloth, goes to Foligno, sells it, gets a big bag of money to go buy bricks. His father hears about it, gets so angry that Francis is doing this. He didn't mind when Francis spent the money on partying that made him popular, but not building churches. Oh, no, 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 no. Francis, no. So he goes to the bishop and he says, "My son took my cloth and sold it without asking me." And the bishop looked at Francis, "Did you do this?" And he said, "Yes." He says, "Francis, you got to give it back." So he takes the money and goes up to his father, and not only the money, but he takes all the nice clothing he's wearing, strips completely naked before his father and the whole town of Assisi that's there, as well as the bishop, gives the clothes that he was wearing and the money to his father and says, "No longer Pietro Bernardone, my father." And he gives him it, turns to the bishop and says, "From now on, our Father who art in heaven." And what Francis did was, that was his way out of the polarization between the nobility and the merchant class, all fighting for who's got power, who's got wealth, and all this stuff. It was Christ. Christ was his way out of the polarization. And see, I think our polarization today has the same gateway for walking out of it, because we could tear each other apart. And of course, that's what was happening at the time of Francis too. The nobility wanted to squash the merchant class because they felt threatened. And Francis found a way out of it, and that was to follow Christ. And I think that's the significance of Francis, I think, for our times, because Christ is definitely the way.
As Jesus says, "I am the way, the truth, and the life." I'm talking with Father Dan Pattee in this new year, this Jubilee year, now dedicated to St. Francis of Assisi. We recognize that 800 years ago was his passing, October 3rd of 1226. So what a beautiful year for us to focus on some of the lessons we can learn from St. Francis. And I just want to go back for a moment, Father Dan. I know we're going to have to take a break, but in that year of his captivity, he's been this battle. There had to have been some kind of change, some kind of, I call it metanoia, in his soul, that something's gone awry, and he comes out of that with this conversion.
Yeah, that's what it was. He felt disillusioned being in the prison. And when he got back to Assisi, he was depressed. He was down. He was going through this sort of he was so gung-ho for the merchant class and selling cloth and being popular and seeking popularity, and he was Lord of the Rebels, as they call him in the writings of Francis. And then all of a sudden it all began to come apart when he was actually on the battlefield, seeing arms get cut off, the hand to hand, the swords, blood, gore, ends up in prison, starts to get disillusioned, and he's looking for another way. What is going on? And of course, that's when Christ begins to lure him out into the desert, where he begins to speak to his heart. So he's going around Assisi, quiet places in prayer, and that's what's going on, is this transformation, this conversion of his heart to a new set of values than those of the merchant class of getting wealthy, gaining power, being popular, to this really an incredible generosity and self-donating spirit, instead of that acquisitive spirit, that acquisition of gaining for yourself. He became so self-giving, self-donating. It's kind of like Christ on the cross. That's what Christ is. He's the medicine for that sort of autocentric spirit that we can get into sometimes for ourselves. And he starts to turn that outward and become so self-giving, self-donating. That's the great challenge, I think, where Francis is going from idolatry to true worship of the one God through Jesus Christ. And that's really the conversion. But it wasn't easy. It was a sort of a depressing, disillusioning time for him.
And such the case is that God is always calling. He's always desiring our heart. And here's Francis finally waking up, hearing that allurement, that deep call, my son, come to me. And so Christ is the way out of these divisions, out of this mess. And what a great thing, I think, this year for Pope Leo to invite us to go deeper into the heart of Christ through the eyes and the lens of St. Francis. I'm talking with Father Dan Pattee as we celebrate this beautiful year of Jubilee, to invite St. Francis to pray for us and to guide us into the cross of Jesus Christ. We have more things to talk about, Father Dan, but we are coming up to a break, so stay with me and we'll continue our conversation about the Jubilee year of St. Francis.